About that. Yes, hi everybody. My name is Tao Fei and I'm the program producer at 221A. In light of the news that emerged this past month of the mass graves of 215 children found on the former grounds of the Kamloops Residential School in Secwepemc Territory, and as news of more grim discoveries continue to emerge across this country, we continue to sit with the great grief and harrowing truth of this moment, even though these horrors have, of course, been long spoken about by Indigenous communities and residential school survivors. For those of you joining from outside of Canada, we'll include a list of media links to contextualize these recent developments. 221A being located on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, close neighbors to Secwepemc traditional territories, we cannot look away from the brutality upon which our presence as a settler-led organization is predicated. That every time we speak about land in the context of so-called Canada, as we'll be doing so today, we are also always speaking of lands that carry the trace of Indigenous death and erasure. That the twin workings of cultural genocide and land theft under the settler colonial state of Canada cannot be decoupled. As the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report makes very clear, quote, "The Canadian government pursued this policy of cultural genocide because it wished to divest itself from its legal and financial obligations to Aboriginal people and gain control over their land and resources," unquote. A process that continues, of course, today. So you'll see in this slide here a list of links where you can support the Secwepemc Nation and other Indigenous groups through this harrowing time, at the same time that they're protecting their territories from continuing colonization and resource extraction. For example, at the Fairy Creek blockade, where land defenders are currently resisting the industrial logging of old growth forests. The photo in this slide on the left side is of an artwork by the artist Wes Harmon, which hangs in front of the Vancouver Art Gallery. Entitled "The Lowest Bar," it expresses how land acknowledgements are really the lowest bar in the urgent process of reconciliation and restitution in this country. In front of it, on the steps of the gallery, are 215 tiny shoes memorializing the children lost. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Jesse now.
Thank you, Tao, for your territorial acknowledgement and sharing where we're at in Canada with a heavy heart and a wounded psyche as we re-engage our relations with Indigenous nations to deal with this reality. My name is Jesse McKee, and I'm the head of strategy at 221A. I lead the organization's research, programming, communications, and advancement. And we're gathered today for a program that's part of the launch of 221A's digital strategy titled Blockchains and Cultural Padlocks. We've just completed our research phase of the initiative and have published a research report of our findings, values, and recommendations. We convened a research cluster to investigate the potential of blockchain as an institutional technology. And through this collective work, a freely available 200-page PDF was produced. It includes research papers that survey our culture's ability to enable a mass collaborative financial turn, developed with new models of digital cooperativism. The Emergent Strategy is to enable the conditions for recommoning land, data, and objects through the development of responsive and resilient asset sharing, power distributing, and value generating networks. We are supported by the Canada Council for the Arts Digital Strategy Fund, which awarded a multi-year grant to 221A in the organizational transformation stream of its awards. This funding program, which awarded grants from 2018 to 21, supported strategic initiatives that will help artists, groups, and organizations better understand the digital world, engage with it, and respond to the cultural and social changes it's producing. Just briefly, for those of you who might be joining us for the first time here at 221A, Just to give you a sense of what we are as an organization. We were founded or initiated as a student club at Emily Carr University, which was motivated by the tension between art and design and all of the differences and kind of challenges that each discipline would put toward each other. And then in 2007, we were founded as a non-profit society here in British Columbia. And that started at a collectively run space in Vancouver's Chinatown, East Georgia Street, 221 East Georgia, where the original members of 221A shared studio space in the back, and a small kind of gallery was made up front. Since that time, we've grown into a larger network of cultural use properties across the city. We now operate 5 cultural use properties for a total of over 50,000 square feet of cultural use space, which is shared with artists, other nonprofits, and other forms of makers and designers, and all of that space is below market and on a cost recovery model. So we do have a collaborative model that we work with a larger community to kind of exist as 221A. We also work with public art and produce that, and we also have a research program that supports fellowships and projects like our Blockchains and Cultural Padlocks initiative. Our mission is to work with artists and designers to research and develop social, cultural, and ecological infrastructure. And our vision is for all people to have the means to make and access culture. You can find our report, the Blockchains and Cultural Padlocks Digital Strategy Research Report, on our website, 221a.ca, which is free to download. Just one sec. Okay, so today I'm joined by one of 221A's current research fellows and a partner on our digital strategy, which is the nonprofit organization DOMA, represented today by Maxime Rokmaniko, who's calling in from Kyiv, Ukraine, as well as the Blockchains and Cultural Padlocks researcher Maral Sotoudehnia, who's a critical geographer based in Victoria, British Columbia. Maral authored a research paper in our report entitled Encrypting Enclosures, Fractionalized Real Estate on the Blockchain. As respondents today, we've invited Andy Yan, who's director of Simon Fraser University's City program here in Vancouver, and he's provided crucial research and analysis over the past decade in Vancouver's intensifying housing crisis. As well, we have Ian Spangler, who is a PhD candidate in geography from the University of Kentucky in Lexington, who's been studying platform real estate with a critical lens. Please allow me a moment just to introduce each of our speakers more formally, since their backgrounds and their own research are so varied. I think it's important to know what's informing the ideas that you'll each can be contributing to our conversation today. Maxime Rokmaniko is an architect, designer, and entrepreneur. His research and design work explores new forms of urban living enabled by emerging technologies. He's the founder of the architectural practice, the Center for Spatial Technologies, also in Kyiv, and the project lead at DOMA, which is shared between Paris and Kyiv. And it's a proposed housing platform for the cooperative token economy. Maral Sotoudehnia is a PhD candidate in the University of Victoria's Department of Geography. Her research investigates the cultural politics and commodification of digital urban spaces shaped by global policies, peer-to-peer systems, and smart technologies. Equally influencing her scholarship are contemporary approaches to critical data studies, feminist political economy, and new materialist scholars that foreground questions surrounding access, citizenship, embodiment, financial exclusion, social justice, and subjectivities in relation to multi-scalar decision-making processes. Her doctoral research project, supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, traces an ethnography of contemporary life under distributed but rambunctious instances of capitalism generated by blockchains and cryptocurrency markets. Ian Spangler is a geographer, writer, and cartographer based in Lexington. Spangler is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Kentucky, and his dissertation work explores the spatialization of digital real estate platforms. He's asking the questions, how do new technologies for the management, transaction, surveillance, and surveillance of real estate transform how we come to own the earth, and perhaps importantly, who gets to own it? Andy Yan is director of Simon Fraser University's City program. He's extensively worked in the nonprofit and private urban planning sectors. He specializes in the field of urban regeneration, applied demographics, geographic information systems, neighborhood development, public outreach, social media, and quantitative research. He's a registered professional planner with the Canadian Institute of Planners and a certified geographic information systems professional. He's been a visiting scholar at New York University's Asian Pacific American Studies Institute, as well as a visiting scholar at Simon Fraser University's Institute of Governance. He served on the board of directors for the Downtown East Side Neighborhood House, and he's held a chair with the David Suzuki Foundation's Climate Council and the City of Vancouver's Planning Commission. So the topic of our conversation today, Recommoning Territory, Diversifying Housing Tenure with Platform Cooperatives. We're going to address a platform's potential to inspire cooperative housing models at civic scale. So this means people getting together to achieve a common goal and sharing the value that's collectively generated. DOMA is a project that envisions a smart commons where people can pool their resources to raise their collective power while lowering the cost and barriers to membership for the services and products associated with home. Developed in anticipation of blockchain technology's broader adoption, DOMA offers a flexible, secure, and transparent model for the many to have a stake in their city. Throughout DOMA's time working with 221A as a fellow since the beginning of this year, they've been developing a closer study of the Lower Mainland's housing market in partnership with the Center for Spatial Technologies, also in Kyiv. I just want to give a shout out to a few people who've collaborated on the work that Maxime will give us a preview of today. And they include Charles Pan, who's an MA candidate in Community and Regional Planning at the University of British Columbia, who worked with 221A as a sustainability scholar this academic year, as well as Francis Seng, a systems developer and researcher based in New York, as well as Olesia Kovalenko, German Midic, and Mykola Holovko from the Center for Spatial Technologies. Thank you all for your research, curiosity, and ongoing work with this project. Together, they are creating a digital dashboard with a rich array of interrelated data sets related to housing over the past decade in these territories known as Vancouver. And they're modeling an affordability index calculator, which is helping us develop a platform narrative for DOMA as an example of how it could exist here. This research provides insights towards the methods we could collectively leverage to shift the housing tenure model of the city and diversify a centuries-long monoculture of over-squeezed rentership and indebted home ownership. To set the stage for our speakers today, I want to give you a bit of insight into our strategy. I'll read a brief excerpt from my editorial essay in our report, as well as look at some key terms we're working with in our strategy. The section of the essay I'm going to read from is subheaded Blockchain in the Back, Business in the Front. So, since the crypto winter of 2018, and following the collapse of overinflated cryptocurrency markets and exchanges, blockchain as a technology has become somewhat of a cheap trick cited by companies and organizations purporting that their products and services would be advanced by blockchain, without much evidence in their back end to support the lofty proclamations. Some sage advice was offered to our project team and made the 2019 Blockchain at UBC annual conference here in Vancouver. Put your business model out front and develop the blockchain technology to support it in the back. In other words, don't lead with the technology. Blockchain itself is an ideology, not a business model. It's not an ideology and it's not a business model. It can be used in many ways. It could be used by a neoliberal ideology, by emergent ideologies that are more socially and ecologically aligned, and by those who lead conversations that confuse decentralization with libertarian politics. So cultural padlocks as a strategy offers is an opportunity for 221A and our collaborators to take stock of an emerging digitally native economy while advancing the organization's mission of creating new forms of cultural, social, and ecological infrastructure. In our research, we came across two standout wide-scope models for development opportunities that prioritize more cohesive and aligned social futures in their public-facing iterations as they exist today, while working on blockchain in the back end. Though these initiatives find their roots well before blockchain's arrival in 2008, the scope and reach of their efforts achieves power gained through network effects. It has become clear in researching these models that the broader the network, the more sense blockchain makes as an enabling technology. The first example I'll cite is the platform Cooperative Consortium, which roots itself in the 1886 Rochdale Principles. Sorry, I just lost my screen there, that have formed the basis on which cooperatives around the world continue to operate today. Trevor Schultz of the New Schools Institute for the Cooperative Digital Economy founded the consortium, which includes partners across the Americas, Asia, and Europe. Through their work, they've been able to provide essential development advice and support for worker-led digital cooperatives that assemble and aggregate their value locally, such as nanny services and ride shares, enabling more competitive services, greater compensation, and more reliable job security to workers. This gives such small organizations collective competitive power in relation to the mainstream platforms that have become icons of the ill-fated first-generation sharing economy, such as Uber and Airbnb, which are underpinned by exploitive and extractive corporate principles. Only in the past few years has the platform consortium begun developing quietly with blockchain, enabling this new wave of cooperative social enterprise to be enhanced with the power of a decentralized internet of value. The second example that I'll cite is the Black Socialists of America and their dual power map, which is inspired by the Leninist principle that workers should hold dual power in a society, a concept that led to the October Revolution. In the 21st century, dual power or counterpower, it's been used to refer to non-violent strategies of achieving a socialist economy by means of incrementally establishing and then networking institutions of direct participatory democracy to contest the existing power structures of the capitalist state. The American art critic Yates McKee, no known relation to me, describes a dual power approach as, quote, forging alliances and supporting demands on existing institutions, elected officials, public agencies, universities, workplaces, banks, corporations, museums, while at the same time developing self-organized counter-institutions, end quote. So the Black Socialists of America's dual power map has become their core strategy, and it began by crowdsourcing and aggregating worker-owned businesses across the US. They found that large corporate enterprises, which for them were firms that had over 500 employees, made up roughly 51% of the overall employment in the US. Of course, this data is pre-pandemic, whereas the remainder was shared by medium, small, and very small enterprises. So this was an optimistic finding that showed that the political potential of uniting such businesses and their workers to harness the economic and political power held within these networks could be possible. And seeing the massive kind of effects that have happened to the employment scenario in the US after the pandemic, this is just more room for these kind of strategies to take root. So the Black Socialists of America have signaled that they're working with blockchain developers to find ways to incorporate the technology into their ongoing work, and given the nature of the way the dual power map has been assembled, it seems likely that they'll be able to implement a pertinent use case for things such as smart contracts to manage and share asset control and distribution through responsive and urgent means. That the Black Socialists of America are not yet revealing their findings or providing much public insight into this development comes as no surprise. So the disruptive nature of this work towards the United States corporate-led economy is not only a trade secret, but also a means for workers to take the controls back after generations of aggressive anti-labor action by disabling unions and diminishing employment legislation brought about from the liberal globalist politics of the past 30 so years. Combine this with the legacy of how the US responds to Black-led self-organization through regimented domestic terrorism enacted by state security forces against its own citizens by conducting surveillance, psychological operations, character attacks, community intimidation, bodily violence, and openly targeted assassinations, it's clear that the BSA has plenty of reasons to keep its blockchain developments buried deep until the most socially contagious use case for their network is found and made into scalable tech. Maral Sotoudehnia, who's joining us today, a feminist geographer and PhD candidate at the University of Victoria, looks into some of the early promises being made too quickly by finance-driven startups, with socialized ideas in mind as selling points, pointing out that these ideals are not evident within their design and outcome. In her paper, Encrypting Enclosures, Fractionalized Real Estate on the Blockchain, which 22NA commissioned as part of this initiative, it becomes clear that without cultural and social networks to feed back into the design of such platforms, they turn out to be lizard-brained, and their smokescreen ambivalence reveals major pitfalls that could further damn oppressed communities seeking equity and justice today. Sotoudehnia further raises questions that were also brought forth more broadly by the GameStop meme stock scenario of earlier this year, which is about the rights and access publics are afforded as investors versus the more traditional accredited investor route with high barriers to entry. Her writing offers an exemplar of what cultural work has to offer to the world, a space for review, critical engagement, and holistic advancement of the tech sector's lofty but often shallow ideals and notions about its own ability to improve our common conditions. So one startup that does seem to be offering a critical lens and perhaps an anti-capitalist cultural positioning is DOMA, the nonprofit, which is developing a platform cooperative for housing. In 2019, DOMA traveled to Vancouver to join us as we worked with the University of British Columbia and Emily Carr to host a series of events and workshops and public presentations around the platform. DOMA's proposed users are token holders, like shareholders, who increase their stake in a housing co-op as they start paying monthly dues for access to a network of properties rather than buying or renting a single unit. This allows for the occupant to remain in place and accrue equity over time while decreasing monthly payments, and it would allow for movement between network-owned units to adapt to the scale of household changes over time, offering flexibility with stability. With such a well-honed use case and critical approach to the development space, 22NA continued to work with DOMA as a fellow throughout 2020 and 21 to more closely study, model, and assess how their platform might be used to counteract the deleterious housing crisis in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, which has been brought on by speculative finance tools of the past couple decades. Today, Maxime will give us a preview of some work in progress on this front, but by no means is this a finished project yet, and we'll have another event later in the year to kind of look at what they've been working on with us more fully. So the strategic dismantling of kind of late stage capitalism and the rebuilding of kind of socialist ideals within Western economies and politics is going to be enabled by a growing constituency of millennials and Gen Zs. However, this is not a socialized movement that is ideologically or patriotically led. The artist Joshua Citarella, who surveys and analyzes emergent political theory and culture in online communities, refers to this wave of socialism as more akin to the common sense realization that bulk buying plans result in the best possible agency to provide increased quality of life for the many. Considering the still accelerating techlash that happened post-2016, as the egregious abuses of information and content management by social media companies such as Facebook and Twitter and consolidated data powerhouses like Google have become now common public knowledge, forging a social environment to develop alternative futures should become a priority of the cultural realm. We have a ready and willing audience and population eager to explore alternatives to the dire and downwardly mobile future we're still hurtling toward. In the past couple of years, 2 books on this topic have breached bestsellers lists and have influenced some, even in older generations, to consider these ideas more deeply and think about radical design changes to their practices. And this shows us the potential to align the digital realm to meet the social and political ideals of our societies today. And we can collectively work to improve social, economic, and political literacy towards these ends. Jenny Odell, an artist and professor at Stanford, she wrote How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, and it was a meandering, intuitive, and effective series of personal essays about her artistic practice and intellectual preoccupations, which can be summarized with her idea that capitalism, colonialist thinking, loneliness, and an abusive stance towards the environment all co-produce one another. This tangled mess is something that won't be solved through technology alone, but rather through shifting perspectives and re-articulating the interdependencies we've been ignoring. Those interdependencies that exist between one another, our histories, and the bioregions we inhabit are too externalized as they are today, and they create a sense of separation and atomization. We are rarely adequately able to account for our cultural work and thinking. Another book on this topic would be Shoshana Zuboff's work and The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power has become an urgently needed canonical text that will hopefully inspire the drafting and design of a new type of digital realm, a realm striving to become uncoupled from the controlling and intrusive surveillance practices of the major tech platforms as they exist today. As Zuboff notes in an interview related to the release of her book, surveillance capitalism was enabled by the US state. And now it's reached such a powerful and pervasive phase that it's undermining the democracy that bore it. In offering alternatives, she proposes that it's impossible to imagine surveillance capitalism without the digital, but it's easy to imagine the digital without surveillance capitalism. So this calls us again in the cultural field to work to imagine spaces within the digital where we can design new forms of participation that'll be leveraged on self-sovereign identities rather than spilling our personal data into every platform we encounter without consent. This is both an idea and a movement that leverages the notion that individuals should have agency over their digital identities and the data they produce. The notion of the self-sovereign digital identity is core to blockchain's potential to build a new internet that's leveraged on a transparent management of individual and collective data and assets through the use of smart contracts, which adhere to our chosen principles of engagement and exchange. I'll end the reading of my essay here. The full essay is available in the report on our site, 22na.ca. Just allow me to share my screen again before I sign off. I'm just going to share a couple of key terms with everybody, and I did have some visuals for you. Oh, great. Can everybody see that now? Is that okay? Great. Great. So just to start, this is a slide from the essay Squad Wealth by the Other Internet Group. Highly recommend it. But it kind of breaks down what we're looking for in terms of this new digital realm, in terms of creating new institutions, creating a sense of future togetherness, and ultimately what this means to collectivize power is creating squad wealth. And a central kind of tagline of our strategy is to enable a kind of a digital commons and a digitally cooperative future. So just looking at these terms, I'm going to kind of cite the commons according to Dimeji Onafua, a designer who one of our board members, Laura Kozak, introduced us to. We're very grateful for this. Dimeji says, a commons is a resource that is shared by a group of people. Historically, a commons has been a physical resource, for example, a land resource, but its definition has now expanded to non-physical, human-made resources such as peer-to-peer information networks. The physical commons, therefore, relate to physical resources and their use. Oh, sorry, you're seeing my scripts instead of the slides. One sec here. Oopsie daisy. Is that better?
That looks good.
Sorry about that. I'll just give you a view back into sorry, two screens here. I don't think you saw this one, the squad wealth slide, which is pretty important. So yeah, I would totally recommend this essay. It's on the Other Internet's website, otherinternet.net. Very easy to find. Oops, and then back to the commons. Sorry, the commons is a resource that's shared by a group of people. Historically, a commons has been a physical resource, for example, a land resource, but its definition is now expanded to a non-physical human-made resource. The digital commons relates to aspects of the non-market networked information economy that are controlled and negotiated by social exchanges and agreements. Networks here represent systems of human interaction, emphasize the humanness of our structural patterns. Physical commons may also be further categorized into open commons like oceans, air, highway systems, and limited access commons like pasture agreements for farmers, or regulated like forests that have restrictions and use placed on them, which has become a growing issue of concern here in British Columbia in the past couple of weeks around the encampment protesting the logging at Fairy Creek. And there's also the unregulated commons, which does exist, like grazing pastures for farmers with no use restrictions. Totally recommend checking out his work on his website on Recommoning, just onafua.com/recommoning, if you want to see more of his 7 principles, which are illustrated here. Great, and so we're going to talk about land next, and this is a definition according to the United Nations Conventions to combat desertification. And the image that we're seeing comes from a diagram from the study, which is called Property Rights and Property Wrongs, Micro Treaties with the Earth, which was authored by Dark Matter Labs, the McConnell Foundation, and Civic Indigenous. It's available on Dark Matter Labs Medium page. And it's showing us the different kind of interface layers that we kind of have to negotiate, or we're forced to negotiate kind of in a neoliberal economy around access and use of land, which brings us through private property title, municipal laws, provincial laws, federal laws, constitutional law, and then the foundational law, which is Indigenous law and kind of protocol for the land. So the United Nations is saying that land is a terrestrial bioproductive system that comprises soil, vegetation, and other biota, and the ecological and hydrological processes that operate within that system. Our perceptions of land are not only a response to the outside world, but also a cause and effect of cultural filtering, by which certain phenomena feature prominently while others recede into the background. In other words, the less visible the elements of land are able to in other words, the less visible the elements of land there are to a particular stakeholder, the less meaning they have for that person and perhaps result in a lack of awareness as to their possible critical function. The meaning and value of land can change as we become wealthier or do not directly depend on the land for our immediate survival. Furthermore, land is often infused with a feeling of sovereignty and jurisdiction, aligned with different patterns of ownership and use rights, which in turn governs our economic and socio-political interactions and conflicts with others. All these factors influence attitudes towards land use and the way that land is managed. Nevertheless, keeping land in a healthy state is an essential contribution to human security. Access to food and water, the stability of employment and livelihoods, resilience to climate change and extreme weather events, and ultimately social and political security. Recognizing the perspectives of diverse stakeholders and ensuring their participation in decision-making is a critical first step towards better land management and planning. Land is owned and managed by governments, corporations, communities, and individuals, but we all depend on the land for our health and for our well-being. And then finally, to talk about data, I've taken a quote from Yishan Wu, who's the Deputy Director of the Institute of Scientific and Technical Information of China. So he says that data are artifacts that reflect a phenomenon in the natural or social world in the form of figures, facts, plots. Information is anything communicated among living things. It is one of the three mainstays supporting the survival and evolution of life, along with energy and materials. Finally, knowledge is a human construct which categorizes things, records significant events, and finds causal relationships amongst things and or events in a systemic way. Thank you. I'll end it there, and I'll pass it over to Maxime to give us a presentation from our first panelist today. Oh, Maxime, you're still muted there.
Can you hear me now? Jesse, thank you very much for this introduction and generally for all the time of collaborating, really. That's what I will show you now is mostly stuff that we've developed together through this course of this fellowship. I will, though, first start from introducing the team I'm working with, and it's called the Center for Spatial Technologies. We are based in Kiev. We always do these kinds of systematic projects when, you know, it's not like we are architects, but we don't work with these kinds of one client, one project things. We often try to seek for kind of dealing with more infrastructural things. We are on Instagram at spatialtech.info, and generally you can find us in most social media. And this is how also Jesse found us. And it all started from this project we did actually with Dark Matter Labs, who were just mentioned by Jesse a second ago. And the project revolves around this phenomenon of Highline in New York. So what we did with the Dark Matter Labs is also part of the project that they've initiated, which is actually called Smart Commons, was basically trying to figure out this kind of disjunction between public investment that went into Highline and property value uplift that was then privatized. So the work was very basic in terms of everything we used was openly available data, and we also relied on writings of certain geographers and economists whose kind of studies we almost directly visualized. But then even that visualization happened to be quite powerful, as we discovered. We basically managed to show that this kind of development of this area in Manhattan, which happened to be around Highline, costed in general 187 million, and you know, it basically resulted in 3.4 billion of kind of value uplift, and absolute majority of which was then privatized, obviously. And this kind of brings about the larger issue with specifically, you can read more about in the Medium post by DML, where it becomes a question of how we actually then democratize this kind of value that, you know, the city gains from every new development. The city gains from, you know, diversity, from people making their neighborhoods exciting, and most often those things are privatized. Here you can see this kilometer bands from Highline, and actually like the difference in terms of value uplift through almost 10 years of existence of Highline is pretty obvious. And you can also see the correlation here, which is like every dot represents property, and the curve is representing the kind of amount of value uplift, kind of depending on distance from Highline. Yeah, so this was done almost more than a year ago. And this happened to be the way we started to work with 221A. But the project that I will share with you today, and generally the project that 221A supports within the fellowship, is called DOMA. And it's a project that kind of started from this very basic frustration about housing crisis. And, you know, like, I'm an architect by training, and I'm very used to think about housing crisis. We were many times asked to develop housing solutions for contexts where people cannot afford homes, and all the trickery that you can imagine about smart house plannings and, you know, like smaller apartments, kitchens and stuff like that, obviously does not help on infrastructural level. So, you know, what actually happening on an infrastructural level is this comment that one MIT student published after Thomas Piketty's book came out, which is basically that the backbone of the fact that capital is growing faster than incomes is housing. That actually housing kind of encompasses most of that growth. And, you know, I mean, an easy thing about working on such a project is that everyone understands the pain, right? Like, I mean, I guess like most of people, where we come, they've been at least in some phase of their life very well familiar with these issues. And then we basically tell them about DOMA, which is a project which, in its core, there is this idea that we could finally figure out some sort of urban software, as we call it, one that simply connects existing residential units, existing apartments and houses, with community of users in a different way. And of course, for us, blockchain was really important in terms of coming up with this project, thinking about areas that were there before I mean, I also, like, as an architect, I studied a lot about grouping and other forms of collective housing, cooperatives, community land trusts. But very basic idea that kind of constitutes the core of DOMA is that the property can be tokenized, so we can all kind of co-invest in one apartment. Currently, where I'm speaking from, it's legally impossible to even own an apartment with an unrelated person. Like, if we two of us, if say one of me cannot afford a home, with friends, we would be able to kind of invest and purchase a collective home that's not fully legally possible, which is again like one simple barrier. And then the more tricky idea that DOMA proposes is this idea of equity generation. So the reason for this is such that where DOMA was originally conceived for, which are Ukrainian cities, rents are extremely high comparing to property prices. You will not believe it, but the apartments here can be purchased for less than, I don't know, like 60,000 US dollars. But at the same time, rents are comparable to most of European cities and even some of the North American cities, which makes the period that you would buy a home with rent you pay very low. So price to rent ratio in years of rent paid that you would be able to buy the house you're renting is around 12 to 14 years, which is really, really low comparing to places like Vancouver. So the idea was that since we now can generate this interesting way of kind of pulling money together, co-investing, #squad wealth into properties, we then could also think about ways to redistribute the value of that investment, and specifically the appreciation of the asset with future tenants. So the idea was that if I'm renting a house that I could have purchased for 12 years of rent, wouldn't it be fair if at least after those 12 years I would generate a certain amount of equity in that house? So we have been calibrating this scheme and been thinking about how to do this best in Ukrainian context, but meanwhile we were also traveling a lot and coming to different places across mostly Europe, but also happened to be Vancouver. And what that brought to us is an understanding how different and how complex situations with housing crisis are in different cities. So housing crisis in Kiev is even radically different from one in Moscow, and is as different from Western European cities. I mean, specifically, we somehow focus on world cities still, because these are cities that are close to our team's kind of knowledge. And so based on this diversity of cities and diversity, so here, like, these are organized by price to rent ratio, but then also mortgage as a percentage of income. In Ukraine, almost none purchases of housing include mortgage, which again, I can imagine is hard for you to believe. Only 2% of people prefer to use some sort of financial leverage. And simply this happens because mortgage is extremely expensive. The third parameter that we look here is price to income ratio, which also has a lot to do with how people can afford homes. But obviously there are many more parameters that you can look at and see how the nuance of housing crisis kind of manifests itself in different places across the globe. So first attempt to do something with that kind of understanding was this game that we developed for a range of art shows that were canceled because of COVID. I mean, we started to develop this kind of artificial city, which always kind of repeats an existing city, but we conceal which city it is. But we take all the data, including average rents, average home values, generally like normal incomes for people, population, stuff like that. Also dynamic of how new housing is being constructed and stuff like that. So we basically developed this also with Francis Tsang, whom Jesse already introduced as one of the contributors to the project. We developed this little game where you can actually access it by going to play.doma.city and like try to go through this challenge of trying to find a house in a city, and then maybe discovering some sort of colleagues with whom you would try to gain the stake in the city back. The Vancouver project and collaboration with 221A seems to make perfect sense in terms of this trajectory that I just described. So this is already a map of Vancouver and some data crunching attempts that we had in the very beginning of this process, when we were looking at this weird spike in property prices that happened in 2018. Very curious to see that case study comparing to some of the other places where we see the slow and steady growth and push for people who can less and less afford homes. But here there is this kind of paranormal events, and we tried to study them in as kind of close way as possible. Also, with the help of Jesse, we conducted mostly Jesse with a range of interviews where they basically try to figure out an opinion about this of many experts, and there we have one of them joining this call, his presentation. I'm very looking forward to see in the end. So yeah, I mean, as we heard from many of these presentations, situation in Vancouver is quite particular. And basically, what I'm showing you now is we are people who are very far from that place, is an attempt to data crunch those things and see what's going on in Vancouver actually. And basically, we've developed this way to analyze property prices, look at rents, try to scrape some data, try to generate some information that we don't have, trying to understand and how incomes changed and stuff like that. So the final product that, as Jesse announced, we will share by the end of our fellowship will be very much based on something like this, which is an online interactive map where you can click around things and learn about the situation in Vancouver. But as we showed in that case with New York, we are looking for these particularly simple but telling examples. And I'll propose two very simple things to you. I'm very curious, maybe if there will be opinions about them over the discussion. And generally, you know, because the project is on the way, we would be very happy to hear any sort of feedback about this. So one thing that we are discussing with the team is the relationship of median household income and rents. And of course, there is this, I don't even know who came up with the fact that it needs to be 30% in an ideal world. I guess that's kind of the generational standard that some of the parents often tell to their kids. But the idea that, you know, like the ratio of that we spend on rent, the ratio of our income that we spend on rent is growing, and it's actually doesn't look so bad in Vancouver as it does in some of the European cities that we studied. But a very simple thing to see is, you know, given a certain income and certain social position, you'd be able to, on that kind of dashboard, see what parts of city you can afford and how does city welcome you or not with that kind of social situation. The other much more concerning for Vancouver situation is the situation with housing prices. And that situation has to do with the fact that similarly to this 30% rule, we found this legend that the bank will give you a mortgage which constitutes around 4 to 4.5 times your median yearly income, which in case of Vancouver looks super scary because these curves not even intersect in 2005, and generally speaking, only from what we looked, only 2.5 percentile of incomes in terms of top 2.5% of incomes can think about affording average home, which is honestly quite crazy. So what we are thinking about is to make some of things like this available for you to play around on the map, seeing both the map and these charts, trying to see how things change through the time. This is something that we're currently working on, and we are also having a lot of issues with data, and there are some things that are a bit more tricky to figure out. I guess the general tension we're trying to explore here is this complexity for one to transit from being a renter to being an owner, because, you know, the more of your income you spend on rent, the harder it is to generate savings, right? And in this situation, it's quite hard to think about, even for us now as people who are far from Vancouver. It's clear that for people in Vancouver, it's very hard to think about ownership. So this is exactly where we start to also think about kind of new embodiment of DOMA. Is there a way, if we cannot afford homes as individuals, to think about trying to gain a stake in the city in this kind of way, and where we collectively try to pool our resources and do something about this situation together? We are still studying this, and there will be kind of, I think by the end of this process, we'll gain even more nuanced understanding of these things, also thanks to people like Andy and all the other people we interviewed, and, you know, like people we have a chance to talk to. But basically, yes, these things will get their new iteration that is specific to Vancouver. And yeah, I mean, this is kind of the rough outline of what we're working with 221A. It's very good to be here. Thanks for this invitation, and any thoughts on this will be very much welcomed during the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Maxime. That was so nice to see, with the green screen effect too. We'll pass it over to Maral, who will share some more about her paper with us.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Maxime. Nice to see you. I think we met before COVID in Vancouver. I don't have a green screen. I do have some slides, but they're not going to stand up to what you've got going on, Maxim. I'm so sorry. Okay, let's see if I can share this. So if y'all can see that. Yeah, so I mean, I think, you know, I have some kind of slides put together just to kind of generally use as visual prompts and to possibly distract you all from what I'm about to say, which really are kind of highlights of some of the ideas and concepts that I tried to grapple with in the paper that I did for 221A for the BACP, the Blockchains and Cultural Catalogs project. And before I start, I just want to big thank you to Jesse, obviously, and Tao from 221A, and everyone at 221A, and I see Rosemary Heather was on, and Rosemary was just the best at, you know, being thoughtful but direct in her editorial process. And I would say the same, you know, the generativity that came from everyone at 221A was just so wonderful. It's really nice to have the intellectual generosity that you know, this organization brings to the table. So just, you know, thank you. A couple things. So, you know, in terms of kind of just to try to pick up kind of some of the ideas that Maxim was presenting. This paper, I think, you know, when we started talking, Jesse, many years ago, I think back in 2018, maybe, you know, we're both living on the coast. I'm calling in from Lekwungen territory, otherwise known as Victoria, British Columbia, which is like the forgotten island off the coast that, you know, compared to Vancouver when we talk about big cities in Canada. But we have a very similar housing affordability crisis in Victoria. We're much smaller in terms of kind of population and density as well, and very different demographics. But, you know, Jesse and I remember chatting and really kind of commiserating over the housing affordability crisis. I mean, like, you know, to your point, I think, Maxim, you know, this notion of kind of thinking about what your ability to, like, whether or not you're capable of moving from a rent to own scheme in your life, or what a mortgage involves, and thinking very critically about the fact that, yeah, you know, even though I'm not a millionaire, if I were to go to a bank, I could probably get a mortgage for over $1 million, which is quite crazy, and quite scary too, right? And meanwhile, rents in the city, like others, and I think you really highlighted this with your presentation, are just essentially kind of in lockstep with what a monthly mortgage payment would look like, which I think really puts these, like, intensifies these existing pressures that have been building over at least, you know, 50 years, if not longer, in different ways. So one of the things that I kind of was really interested in, and having spent a lot of time working on blockchains in a variety of capacities, was this kind of some of the discourses that were circulating at that time about how we might be able to leverage, you know, this technology to solve that particular crisis. To think very critically about land and in particular kind of in I think the popular discourses of real estate, right? This notion of kind of squad wealth, you know, that idea that, you know, okay, if maybe I can't enter that market, then perhaps, you know, together we can, and maybe that'll provide us some entry point into kind of a more kind of sustainable housing future. So those are kind of the general kind of ideas that were swirling in my head, and you know, one of the challenges I think is that there are a lot of discourses about the way that we talk about housing and land in particular, to go back to your slide, Jesse, and this notion that, you know, when we think about land, like, and I'm always reminded of Tanya Marie Lee, you know, who has this paper, and she says, you know, land's not like a mat. You can't just roll it up and take it away, right? Like, it's got this real deep materiality to it. And that's really true. And I think we see that kind of really evident in projects like DOMA, for instance. They're really trying to think critically about, like, how do we kind of, you know, live on the land in different ways. And really, I think 221 has kind of foregrounded this a lot with the research in this particular project. But the other kind of way that it circulates, obviously, is as an investment tool, right? And we've heard, Maxim, you were talking some of the contradictions there. And then increasingly with this notion of kind of squad wealth as a consumer good, right? This notion that if I can participate, even partially, then perhaps there are some kind of benefits there to think about. And so those kind of three tranches of thinking, if you will, really kind of coalesce in a bizarre way, I think, when you talk about, just generally finance and housing, but also infrastructure in the context of blockchains particularly, where, that maybe kind of notion of the materiality itself gets abstracted away, that substantiveness of, what does it mean to kind of have that mutuality and some of those anarchist principles kind of falls to the side often, especially kind of, the private sector, where we talk about all of a sudden having this ability to create infrastructure that enables us to essentially kind of take real estate and make it more, in ghost quotation marks, accessible, if you will. And one particular way that kind of was really evident back when I started thinking about this paper was through fractional real estate, right? And this notion that you can take essentially kind of property as we understand it in kind of a general sense and split it up so that multiple people can have access to some component of that investment. Again, really leveraging these notions of using it as an investment tool, but also a consumer good. And that I thought was really quite curious because it sounds seductive. But if you kind of start looking at it, it really raises this question of, and people really do promote this, of these blockchains, do they actually democratize real estate? Do they actually kind of lower those barriers to access? Do they make it, like, is there actually some outcome here to think about? And one of the things that I ended up kind of thinking about was, I kept having these conversations, both through my research and also kind of my work at the time, my paid work, around kind of fractional real estate in particular as being kind of the solution. And like, this is how we solve this problem, especially in the context of kind of Canadian cities. But one of the challenges is that, with blockchains in particular, a lot of these projects are, they're experimental, or they might, at that point in particular, just be proof of concept, if they're even that, or maybe just a white paper. And so I decided to kind of take a bit of a scan and do content analysis of kind of 3 different instantiations of this idea. So they're presented here. One is Realty, Realty. I always get that wrong, Ratium and DOMA, with the massive caveat that, like, yeah, none of these were essentially kind of production ready in any way. And, in some ways, the analysis could only be prefatory based on what was available at the time. And with the recognition that, like, this is a really extremely challenging space to try to do anything. So I think, one of the things that I've always felt, especially since being first exposed to DOMA, is just like absolute, I think, gratitude and awe, for the, I think, the initiative I think that it must take to enter the space and try to do something productive. So I would never have the guts to even try, frankly. So I think that's kind of something that undergirds everything that I have to say here. But, in doing this kind of really prefatory analysis, one thing that kind of became really evident is with the first 2, which, there were so many challenges that seemed quite banal, frankly. But, and maybe a bit of an anecdote here, at the time, because I was being rent evicted and I live in one of these cities that is very similar to Vancouver, the only option I had was to get a mortgage because it was the same price as paying rent. And I was like, this is ridiculous. This is happening last year when I think was wrapping up the paper. And if you've ever gone through, if you have ever had the privilege of having to get a mortgage, and it's not a fun privilege, but one that I definitely have, it's brutal. Like, it's completely opaque. It's like, you just encounter folks that don't give you any information and then just say, like, please give me all your money. And you go, okay, I don't have much, but here you go. And then you just trust that everything will work out. And I saw these challenges reproduced essentially with particularly 2 of these platforms, Realty and Ratium, where, one in particular, the ownership and management models were completely unclear. And this reproduces, I think, real estate experiences as we understand them today, at least in a Western context, in a Western settler context, where, for instance, with both of these different applications, you had to be a particular type of investor, that was kind of legally defined in a certain way under a particular regulatory model to even have access legally to purchase, tokenized claims to portions of a property, which doesn't really solve any problem, frankly. And the other problem, so for instance, one of with these types of fractionalized real estate blockchain solutions, there's a big emphasis on trying to kind of, tokenize essentially kind of these claims to a portion of a property as we understand it in a legal sense. And then, also kind of profit off of the rents that you might be able to collect based on someone essentially kind of managing that property for you, and the collective of folks who have those tokens and remit some kind of wealth accumulation that way. And the management schemes, though they seem kind of ideal in the sense of like, oh, don't worry, there's a collective of folks who come and take this property that you own like 4% of, and they'll send you like $2 a day based on the rent schemes. Completely opaque as well. There was no indication as to how that would work, who's overseeing it, what's the governance model, and that's quite frightening, I think, in terms of kind of thinking about what that means in the context of one's investment, if you will, and even as a consumer good. The other issues that we had that kind of became evident with surrounding, obviously, I think, data collection and privacy. So, both of these particular applications really focused heavily on collecting particular data, asking you to essentially sign everything away through an app, without a lot of recognition that might be kind of dubious in some ways, and or how they were using that data. And I think this is kind of a very common trope at this point, unfortunately, that we run into with digital technologies and datafication in particular. And finally, the documentation for both of these was extremely limited. It was extremely unclear, and also was lacking details surrounding kind of your regulatory obligations. And I think this is something that is really challenging and, again, really quite banal to talk about. But there are rules about how you can invest in things, and you can break them. And like, for instance, I like, Maxime, that you're noting that it's currently illegal to essentially kind of co-invest in Kiev. And that might not be evident to folks, and there might be ramifications surrounding that. And if we want to kind of intervene in those types of regulatory barriers, it's a very different question than just trying to sign up for something thinking that it's kind of a low risk investment, and then having to deal with the outcomes of it actually being quite high risk, personally, downstream. So the third kind of example that I looked at, and again, it was, I'm mindful that DOMA, you've kind of been working very hard, I think, on doing something that's quite challenging, and it's, again, by the time I was looking at this, I think it was still kind of work in progress. But kind of an antidote to those two other examples that I just talked about briefly was DOMA, right? And it's this notion that essentially you try to kind of, instead of reproducing real estate as we understand it, and even property relations, I think what DOMA is trying to do is something really neat, which is you're trying to hack real estate by looking at fractional ownership. So again, taking kind of deeds to properties and tranching them up, but seeking rent to own models that are based on like kind of collective equity, right, towards affordability. And there's kind of this this many-to-many relationship that you're trying to do, really kind of leveraging network effects, which I think is like such a challenging thing to kind of pull off. But it's really laudable, I think, in the context of this particular housing affordability crisis. Because, when you're trying to essentially, and I might be mischaracterizing it, Maxime, so please call me out on it. But one of the things that I thought was really neat is that here, where you're, instead of, sorry, my screen might have been weird. Instead of just kind of taking, a particular property, splitting it up and tokenizing it and saying, okay, now you have access to this, like, 1% of this particular property, you try to kind of do that and then leverage the equity, as you were talking about, to essentially kind of access other markets, right? I think that's one of the intents. And that notion of leveraging equity across markets in an otherwise quite illiquid but global market is pretty cool. And it's also really hard, I think, for people to internalize like what that means and how it operates. And so I think, and I'm mindful of time here, and I don't want to just kind of talk about my paper, and I'd rather listen to folks on the call and have a good discussion. But one of the things that I thought was really neat is that, where you have kind of two examples that really just kind of reproduce the status quo in some ways, but do it under the guise of kind of sharing. I think DOMA provides kind of this alternative where you might actually just even though you're still kind of operating in the same system, you might actually provide ways for people to build that equity collectively in a way that kind of is more aligned with mutual thinking and mutual aid, and towards kind of potentially kind of being able to create spaces that are more accessible in markets that are otherwise completely exclusionary. And that's really hard to sit with, frankly. It's something that I keep thinking about because I don't, it almost felt too good to be true when I first heard the work you were doing. And then, the more that you sit with it and think about it, it's really well thought out. It's really kind of well designed, I think. And it's the kind of work that I think many people should be looking at. And so, like, in brief, do blockchains democratize real estate? Not usually, I think, but maybe. And, one of the kind of some key takeaways were that, especially with the realty and radium examples, and those more kind of traditional, if you will, kind of capitalist approaches to fractionalized real estate using blockchains, there's really kind of an emphasis on digitization to mediate existing forms of enclosure, in some ways intensifying them, in some ways trying to kind of create the veil that there is greater access, but not really. The other thing that I kind of noted is that it intensifies rent extraction in some cases. There's this, so I didn't quite talk about this, but one of the challenges when you start tokenizing real estate and then try to use a rent-to-own model that's predicated on kind of essentially kind of speculative store value in some cases, is that some of these schemes really kind of operated on the model that you could get folks to pay rent daily, which sounds great maybe, but it really presumes that folks renting have liquidity and have access to those resources on a day-to-day basis, which is quite terrible in some cases, and it can actually create new spaces of exclusion. The other issue is that, it obfuscates compliance requirements for those uninitiated real estate investors. And so that notion that, housing should operate as this, form of investment tool or consumer good sounds great perhaps to people who are looking to leverage what little equity they might have or trying to access an otherwise really exclusionary market. But what it actually does is that it puts a lot of risk on the end user. And it introduces new forms of datafication and data valence. And oh, there's a typo there, I apologize. And that's, something that I think a lot of scholars that are interested in any kind of digitization and datafication have noted with other technologies. And so there is that kind of caveat there. In other cases, though, as DOMA shows, it reformats property relations in some ways, which I think is kind of an interesting way to think about it. And it's really challenging to sit with again, to think about what that means, right? I mean, to go from a rent-to-own model where you don't have to put up a bunch of money, and maybe, over time you can leverage that investment to create kind of more equity in a different market, is kind of an interesting idea. And also uses networking capabilities of the blockchain, I think, to enable these more kind of communal forms of equity. And this is kind of that many-to-many relationship that I think, DOMA, a lot of your work kind of speaks to. And I think it can maybe hack the affordability crisis by leveraging that equity to different markets. And again, I think the particular flavor that would enable us to democratize real estate is something very similar to DOMA, where it's kind of coming from a particular kind of positioning that is not just looking to maximize profit for kind of an individual profit or gain, but something that's a lot more collectivist and rooted in kind of this smart commons idea. So, sorry, I just said a lot of words at you. So maybe I'll just stop there. And yeah, I think, again, it's a challenging topic to talk about because ultimately, and I think this is what you're talking about at the top of the panel, Jesse, there's this constant tension of how we use blockchains and how they get conflated with these kind of ideologies when that's not necessarily what that's not their use case. And I think that's kind of an ongoing point of interrogation. So maybe I'll just stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Maral. I mean, I think where we're at in terms of that is it's a new technology, right? And Ben Cervini from a great data foundation in Amsterdam kind of says that technology is technology for maybe 20 years, but then it gets acculturated and turned into like an infrastructure that's more rigid and solid. So we're kind of in this moment right now where these competing use cases and kind of ideologies behind the tech are going to drive its adoption, and we'll see which way it goes. So obviously I can tell where you'd place your bets and where 228 would place its bets on what we'd like to see. But we'll hand it over to Ian now. Maybe you could tell us a bit about the research that you've been doing in a platform real estate as we leave this sharing economy and look towards like maybe a new internet of value.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jesse. And thank you, Maral and Maxime, for sharing some of your your work, and it's exciting to see both the theoretical legwork kind of being executed around these questions, as well as the work that DOMA is doing to sort of investigate various kinds of crises and try to consolidate some of that power back into the hands of tenants. So I'm excited to be here. As Jesse said, my name is Ian. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Kentucky, studying more or less how digital property technologies change and structure our relationships to housing and home. I have some comments on, or maybe some comments, questions on the presentations that both of y'all just gave, but maybe I'll save those until we can kind of converse as a panel, and just give a general overview of some of my research and some reflections on the relationships between what I'm just going to call prop tech today, and processes of housing financialization, both globally and in some situated examples. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. And let's see. There it is. So can everybody see that okay? Great. All right. So like I said, I'm going to be talking about and sort of reflecting on the global housing crisis in a couple of different ways here, both in terms of the financialization of housing and some of these digital technologies for the management and transaction of housing, and home, right? What that means for how we relate as individuals to spaces of like intimate spaces of home. So I do want to take a moment just to very explicitly thank Jesse and the folks at 221A for putting this on, as well as Andy, who I'm excited to hear from shortly. And I want to move forward with this talk with what I think is a somewhat uncontroversial statement. We're in the midst of an ongoing housing crisis. It's an affordability crisis that's rooted in the global dominion of capital, settler colonial logics of land and ownership, and the racial and spatial segregation of home ownership and rentership. It's also a crisis that plays out on the landscape of people's everyday lives, and we all have very different relationships to what that crisis means and does. But I just want to take a moment here to maybe think about what it means to be in an ongoing crisis. And I'm sure that we can think of a number of examples here. But drilling down a bit, it might begin to sound like a sort of paradox or an oxymoron, right? We normally think of crises as events or moments that shock and then lead to aftershocks. And if a crisis is an event that happens, for something to happen, it needs to start and end. It might be kind of hard to conceptualize a crisis as ongoing and ambient and around us all the time. So I want to give some context to this and maybe suggest some start dates for how we can think about the global housing crisis, following some research by Raquel Rolnick, an amazing housing scholar. I'm going to use the late 70s and early 80s as a reference point here. It's during that time that we start to see the economic function of housing start to undergo a paradigm shift that really sees global housing policy transform from making its goal not the well-being of people, but the health of housing and financial markets. And then through things like retirement plans and mortgage contracts, we increasingly see the health of people being yoked and subsequently tied to the health of financial markets. Not that these processes weren't already happening, but they really pick up steam around that time for a lot of different reasons. Now, today we're beginning to see the contours of what we might call a new asset economy emerge, an economy where the ownership of assets, things like housing, is more meaningful in constituting your class position than your labor power. And housing, of course, like I said, is the asset sort of par excellence, and it's increasingly consolidated in the hands of the financial elite, as we know. Even with a start date here, that still doesn't really answer the question of how a crisis can be ongoing and sort of existing around us all the time. And so I want to turn for a moment to Lauren Berlant, a philosopher who writes about crisis in a way that grounds it in these moments of ordinary everyday life. She calls this crisis ordinariness and suggests that while crisis may be triggered by an event, the process that leads to crisis, and therefore the crisis itself, were was always there all along. She argues that labeling something a crisis can sometimes amount to a redefinitional tactic, and the tactic is used to make phenomenon appear suddenly as though they were events. And in some cases, this can conceal the processes that contribute to the origin of crisis and how it perpetuates itself. So Ananya Roy, a planning scholar at UCLA, encourages us to think and cast the processes that lead to crisis instead in a framework for housing justice. And the question of housing, she writes, must be understood in relation to juridico-political structures, the legal order of property to state-sanctioned violence and surveillance. So by extension, the housing question must be understood in relation to justice. Put a bit more plainly by Tracy Jean Rosenthal of the LA Tenants Union, when we call this crisis a housing crisis, it benefits the people who design housing, who profit from housing, not the people who live in it. So I wanted to start with this provocation about what crisis means, because I think that it's important to understand it not strictly as a moment or an event, but as this ongoing process that can reveal its own conditions through continuous forms of happening. In the case of housing, the ongoing crisis conditions include commodification and colonialism, imperialism, neoliberal racial capitalism, all of the things that we sort of understand as these structures and conditions beneath experiences of housing precarity. As Ananya Roy insists, dismantling these conditions in the pursuit of housing justice and tenants' rights requires nothing short of abolition. So, like Maral, I'm also a critical humanistic geographer. And as I said, I research how basically geospatial technologies structure our relationships to the places that we inhabit. It felt natural in a lot of ways to gravitate to digital property technologies, again, prop tech, for my doctoral research. In literal terms, prop tech might be the consummate kind of technology that structures our relationships to where we live. My research program asks how the design and use of prop tech changes our relationships to housing and home. And this involves basically going to a lot of real estate and tech conferences, as well as speaking with software engineers and various kinds of reps at these prop tech firms to try and understand some of the logics that go into producing softwares for the management and transaction of real estate, in particular housing. So these technologies can serve different kinds of goals, often at once, as Maral excellently highlights. Sometimes they can easily facilitate the financialization of housing. They might imagine new forms of collective ownership, as we've seen with the example of DOMA. Sometimes they might do both at once in complicated ways. And while prop tech as an industry bears the marks of the Silicon Valley upstart culture, tries to disrupt through innovation and all of that, it's exciting to see ways in which prop tech is being designed in a battle for housing justice. So following Ananya Roy and the way that she kind of frames an approach to housing through justice and abolition, I propose that we might call these prop techs abolitionist prop tech. And DOMA is certainly not alone in developing technologies that disrupt the kind of standard prevailing regimes of housing, as Jesse has also highlighted today. So in my remaining time, I want to give some context on the state of housing, relationship to financial markets, and offer some specific remarks coming out of my research about how conventional prop tech fits into this rubric of housing finance. I'll just conclude by providing some examples, in addition to DOMA, of abolitionist prop tech that I think is working in exciting ways in pursuit of a more livable housing landscape. So just some background here. When I say housing financialization, I'm referring to the mass privatization of housing as an asset. Today, the landscape of housing financialization is really dominated by corporate landlords seeking the creation of shareholder value. This is kind of where prop tech comes into play. It's often used to efficiently manage these large, geographically disparate property portfolios at scale. So for example, Invitation Homes or American Homes for Rent, these are both largely US examples, though, with the kind of flows of financial capital, it's increasingly globalized, but Invitation Homes is the largest corporate landlord in the world. Their portfolio of single-family rental homes exceeds 80,000 properties. They need lots of software and hardware implementations to automate day-to-day tasks across these apartments and homes. So that's where prop tech comes in. And it often presents itself as very banal sorts of implementations for things like access and entry or paying rent online. So it's important, I think, to pry open those sorts of everyday interactions that we have with these softwares or hardwares to figure out what purpose they're sort of serving and engaging. And I think it's from this paradigm of housing financialization that prop tech emerges as a useful tool for landlords. So some context on the prop tech landscape. I'll be talking specifically about the US where my research is based, but this certainly applies in many other contexts too. So this map here approximates prop tech firms in the US. They're scattered all across the country, predictably clustered in major cities with some overrepresentation in New York and San Francisco. But just to give you a sense of how these firms, where these firms are locating and kind of what kinds of markets they view as important places to implement the software. A kind of cursory media analysis that I conducted shows prop tech has been mentioned in over 470 press articles since 2015. That number has certainly gone up since I made this graph. It probably goes up every day. 80% of the mentions were since January 2019. Venture capital investment has more than quadrupled in this sector between 2015 and 2018. So we can really see that the interest, at least from the business and investor community, is kind of consolidating around this tech as an object of investment and design and use. So many of those articles frame prop tech in terms of exactly the kind of stuff that Maral is talking about in her great paper and in this talk today, right? So disruption, innovation, a revolution in real estate. I've read a number of books by prop tech entrepreneurs. I grabbed a couple of them today. Make Real Estate Great Again, Prop Tech 101, some fascinating reads that I wouldn't necessarily recommend. You know, and in all of these books and reports, self-published books most of the time on prop tech, they emphasize the democratizing power of this tech, the transparency that it creates, and the cost savings that it passes on to customers. And again, as Maral mentions, these are real issues in a lot of cases. You know, the mortgage process can be incredibly intimidating and opaque and complicated. So like many technical implementations, these are grounded in a sense of reality. But suffice to say, the interest that's growing in this sector is largely about reducing the spatial frictions that are created by housing financialization. So the majority of these are investor-focused technologies developed in the interest of capital accumulation while being marketed as transparent, democratizing, and simplifying. So again, as Jesse mentioned, we can see corollaries here to the sharing economy of, you know, maybe 10 years ago as that movement is starting to pick up steam. Now, given the hype around prop tech, it can be hard to kind of evaluate what it introduces, if anything new. Joe Shaw, geographer, clarifies this by pointing out the software stack is key here. So I just want to take a moment to highlight this. The stack performs two functions. It relies on standard protocols of digital information, or what we'll call interoperability. And second, it connects market participants through contingent passive action, or platformization. And these two processes are really what separate prop tech from older forms of property surveillance, like things like old 19th century pedometers or a surveyor's chain, for example. So this is how we can sort of say, you know, what's new here. These are really the dynamics that I want to emphasize. And I want to look at an example now of how this stuff works in one of the most notoriously controversial prop tech firms, Airbnb. Short-term rental vacation platform that connects prospective apartment renters with prospective apartment hosts. Over the years, it's faced lots of criticism for gentrification and neighborhood change. And in the past, this is some of the stuff that my other research has looked at. But something interesting happened with Airbnb in the last year. They instituted a global ban on parties. So this crackdown was in response, certainly, to the widespread criticism of professional Airbnb listings that, despite existing in residential neighborhoods, basically function as party hotels, which is a kind of common thing that you see in critiques of Airbnb. So how does Airbnb, which I would consider a prop tech firm, manage and enforce this ban? The answer is by way of other prop tech implementations. So the first thing is that Airbnb now rejects guests if they don't meet certain criteria, such as being under the age of 25 or lacking a positive review history. The rejection, this is just an example of the text, is based on algorithmic and some manual reviews of what Airbnb calls risk factors that might lead to parties. So this is sort of a predictive way of forestalling complaints about their platform. The second thing is a bit more insidious, I think. Airbnb sells prop tech to its hosts. So here are some examples from Airbnb's party prevention page of prop tech implementations that Airbnb markets under its advice. Noise aware, minute, and room monitor. All of these devices are basically variations of the same idea. They monitor noise levels in a home and send reports to the property owner or manager. So noise aware explains that it allows hosts to, quote, be there without being there. According to the website, the device, quote, sits quietly in the moments where problems arise, giving you insight into places that weren't possible before and the tools to solve issues before they go too far. So in addition to being a sort of strange intrusion into privacy for prospective renters, we can analyze the marketing of noise monitoring prop tech in the context of housing financialization. Again, to reference Maral's paper, Airbnb effectively functions as a means of transforming housing into a financial asset or facilitating the ease of that transformation. In making that happen, though, Airbnb runs into all sorts of frictions, like city governments that are upset with them for evading taxes, neighbors who complain about nuisances next door, and broad coalitions of anti-Airbnb activists who rally against inflations and rent prices and home values. Now, as they face the music, Airbnb is attempting to resolve these frictions through greater surveillance via more software and hardware implementations, without acknowledging that the whole model is built on a faulty foundation. In short, Airbnb created a problem that they're now selling hosts a solution for, I think is how we might boil this down. And it's a bit mind-boggling and, too little too late for many users on whom the popular opinion of Airbnb is souring. Recently, Airbnb was pretty widely panned across Twitter and some news outlets for high fees and poor service. And while these critiques were often funny, they missed the point in many cases. Airbnb's fees are so high now because they're following the rules and conforming to local occupancy taxes and obeying regulations. So the allure of the platform to live locally while traveling affordably was always a fiction predicated on evading their fair share of the burden. And it goes to show that when they play by the rules, the platform really doesn't work well at all. So returning now to my original point here, interoperability and platformization are expressions of power that can reinscribe existing inequities in housing and property relations, right? Interoperability is about connecting these data points through shared standards. Hardware implementations like noise monitors are certainly examples of this. And likewise, platformization obscures dynamics of power in pursuit of value capture, which can have negative impacts for tenants. Desiree Fields, an incredible geographer, actually put me in touch with 221A for today. She argues that platforms like Airbnb create situations in which people get caught up in the imperative to reduce friction and extract yield by closing the space between security and precarity for tenants. So these people are what we might think of as the unwilling subjects of platformization, to kind of paraphrase some of her research. And PropTech affects them in ways that extend way beyond and indeed more nefariously than vacation rentals. I want to move on and I'll try to wrap this up soon because I know we have a lot more time and I'd like to hear from Andy. I just want to go through three examples here of PropTech firms that basically developed within, put to use and replicate some existing inequalities in housing, to borrow language from Simone Brown. So I'll begin here with Neighborly, the landlord's credit business. There was some basically some coverage around this platform in the wake of COVID, right? And on April 2nd, when it became very apparent that people were not going to be able to pay rent widely when the pandemic hit, Dylan Lenz, the CEO of Neighborly, circulated an email to the company's users. Neighborly is basically a risk profile curator. They consolidate lots of different data points on tenants and give that information to landlords. So Len circulated an email around this time to all of their clients to utilize Neighborly's tenant review function, especially including data on whether tenants missed rent on April 1st in order to create a database of potentially delinquent or insolvent renters. To quote that email, The database helps other landlords know in the future if a tenant's been delinquent in the past. So in addition to flying foul of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, Neighborly kind of shows us how tenant data can gatekeep access to housing and is circulated through these PropTech platforms. Another example, Zumper. Zumper strives to be the Airbnb for one-year listings, one-year leasing. However, in 2017, Zumper formed a branch of tenant screening services called Zumper Select. And a Business Insider report found that they systematically screened out Section 8 tenants who inquired about apartments on the site. Now, while exclusionary practices and tenant screening are as old as the real estate industry itself, Zumper's systematic denial was different because it basically relied on these dynamics of platformization and interoperability. Within Zumper, internally, unserviceable was a word that functioned as a code word for government assistant renter, a category which overrepresented Black and Latinx tenants from lower income brackets. So this is functionally no different from redlining policies under the FHA, for example, that give Black neighborhoods the ostensibly race-neutral descriptor subprime, but we can see how it reconstitutes itself in these predictive ways based on triangulating different kinds of data points against each other. To conclude, I just want to look at the real estate brokerage firm Redfin. So they have a company policy that requires properties to be listed at a minimum price determined algorithmically from housing market to market. Now, recently, a lawsuit filed by the National Fair Housing Alliance alleges Redfin's minimum home price policy of excluding buyers and sellers of homes in non-white areas from being able to use their services. So this is I'm showing you an example here of Louisville, Kentucky, and we can see the kind of racial and spatial segregation of home listings that are made available mapped against demographics, particularly non-white and white populations in the city. And the basic takeaway is that if you live in a Black neighborhood, it's highly less likely that you'll be able to participate in the markets created by this platform, the housing markets created by this platform. So Sarah Safransky has described these kinds of things as processes of algorithmic violence. Basically, a standardized form of violence that contributes to the racialization of space and the spatialization of poverty. When mapped onto the existing historical geographies of exclusion that we kind of see through these PropTech firms, I think that it's clear that these resolve all kinds of frictions that PropTech, identifies in financial markets, but for many marginalized tenants and homeowners, they introduce new frictions that are less important to resolve for the circulation of capital. So just by way of conclusion, I want to highlight some abolitionist PropTech, kind of to tentatively calling this category, right? Landlord Tech Watch Map is a anti-eviction mapping project's work that collects implementations of PropTech in people's homes that they don't like or want. Inside Airbnb scrapes data and provides visualizations about Airbnb listings. Just Fix NYC is an app for a wide range of tools like getting your property's rent history or a profile on your landlord. And then Tenant Power is an AI-powered Boston, Massachusetts map that allows you to explore city assessors data to identify other properties that your landlord also owns. And to this list, we can certainly add DOMA's dashboard for exploring the housing crisis and a lot of their other work around understanding and interrogating the conditions that create unequitable relations of housing. So thanks for listening. I'm really excited to talk more about the work and the research that we've seen today. And please let me know if y'all have any questions. You want to see like a bibliography or links to these organizations, stuff like that. We can chat. So thanks, and I'll pass it over to Andy now.
Andy, you're still muted.
Right. Well, yes, the most common statement in 2020 and 2021. Thank you so much, and thank you, Ian, and then thank you, Jesse, and 221A for the invitation to speak to you today. I really wanted to kind of, I think, keep my comments short because I think that the panel discussion, I think, is really this opportunity for a fountain of discourse in terms of what's going on in terms of, I think, property technology, I think in a number of forms. And I think that in one way, I think what brings us together is really the opportunity to kind of see prop tech as a form of social justice. But then I think that what Ian has done is certainly, I think, showed how it can be used the other way around. And so I think that within that kind of understanding, and I think this is perhaps the kind of underlying tone of technology in pretty much the 20th and 21st centuries, that I think that it kind of goes into, I think, an area of interest of mine as I kind of progress forward in my research in housing. And I think these days, a lot of my interest is actually focused on rental and understanding the nature of rental, and in ways through which I think in particular to acknowledge actually the roles of the formal and the informal, and actually how they've interacted together, and actually how it is within the informal ideas of rental that we've actually seen, I think, the opportunities for justice in ways that I think operate invisibly and yet are in one way taken for granted. I think that one of the discussions is really, I think, around the fact that in Vancouver, as we kind of go through the citywide plan, I mean, it's really interesting to kind of see how the city planners have kind of talked about how Vancouver is a renter city, and the expectation was that, well, we've been a renter city since, you know, what, probably 2006. But the fact of the matter is, when you actually look at the record of Vancouver, Vancouver has been, the city of Vancouver, that is, has actually been a majority renter city since 1971. That it was actually quite surprising to actually find that the city has been a city of renters since 1971, simply because I think most people had expected that it was only very, very recent. And I think that we became the city of renters. And I think that the question, I think, then goes into really why we haven't had that recognition, why that hasn't come into that conversation. And I think that in one way, it very much talks about privilege. It talks about how the property owning classes, the property owning status, ownership culture has kind of dominated, I think, the discourse in Vancouver, in this city, and in the region, and probably throughout, I think, throughout North America. And I think that is entirely problematic. Is really we talk about the roles of social justice and being anti-colonial and looking at these kind of unequal relationships. But then I think you focus in and then talk about the role of formality and informality in the rental market in Vancouver. You actually find that the majority of renters actually in metropolitan Vancouver, 62%, actually are in what's called the secondary rental marketplace. That is, they are not in the mass majority of renters in Vancouver are not in purpose-built rental. They're actually in these types of relationships with landlords that aren't necessarily in buildings that were built to be rental. But yet, I think is important to recognize the spectrum of those relationships. We do indeed have, I think, this incredibly pernicious rentier class that's involved in that type of rental. But then on the other side of it, in that informal reality, is a series of, I think, very old ideas around fractionalized ownership and housing by any number of social organizations through which provided levels of affordable housing the marketplace would never produce. And I think that it's in that sector that it hasn't been acknowledged or recognized. I think the most interesting things is that it's also helped produce a level of urbanization, I think, in Vancouver that actually hasn't been really talked about. The original, I think, location of 221A is in an example of that type of building that actually came together, particularly in places like Chinatown, that came together in terms of that type of formalized that type of fractionalized ownership. And I think that it's coming in that type of realization. It's also then when you start looking into particular neighborhoods, you actually find that in certain neighborhoods, 97% of that rental, of all the rental in certain neighborhoods in the city of Vancouver, are actually in this secondary marketplace, this informal marketplace. And I think that also, I think, is important to recognize this, because as we kind of begin on a political level to valorize purpose-built rental, there isn't necessarily the understanding that they only provide a certain type of rental for a certain population, for a certain characteristic, that they're perhaps really good in terms of producing rental housing for for singles and for couples, but also at market rates. So that these days in Vancouver, those market rates are typically in ways through which are completely outside the ranges and affordability of traditional renters, and much less the kind of diverse characteristics of those living in rental housing. I think that that really goes into then, I think, this discussion about the interaction, not only between housing tenure, but then between housing types. And as such, really the discussion about actually what you discover is that in this kind of informal pool of rental, you actually find that's precisely where much of the rental housing for families are going to be, that they're ground oriented, they're located in neighborhoods that are family friendly. They're not in this kind of hyper urban Vancouverism kind of flash in the pan kind of idea of what the city is, but then it is truly the essence of what I think makes Vancouver a great city, or being somebody who grew up in this city, that it was this type of availability in terms of this type of housing, this type of rental housing, in terms of its not only affordability, but then its suitability, that I think is important to acknowledge and to observe. But then at the same time, the role that I think Ian has talked in terms of prop tech, the emergence of Airbnb, it has, I think, in any number of cities around North America, around the world, has absolutely, I think, run a scythe right through this type of rental. That it has attempted to formalize, it has attempted to codify, it has attempted to ossify these ideas of rental, and its relationships to tenants, and I think has done an incredible damage in terms of the fabric of affordable housing. I think that it's now touching upon. That being said, I think the discussion, I think today, is really about the opportunities, I think, in blockchain to introduce a level of transparency, and to really, I think, bring forward and to perhaps offer an opportunity in terms of evening out the kind of informational asymmetries there are in these relationships. And as in that process, you now then have the possibilities of, I think, these types of technologies as part of a social justice agenda. It's not going to be perfect. I think it's a number of challenges, but yet at least we can at least begin and bring forward that type of conversation. Now, that being said, I think it's also connecting up to, I think, existing policy tools. I think the idea of registry, that the idea of a rental housing registry is really just actually quite simple in terms of a comprehensive inventory of rental stock, in terms of buildings and units, rents, and lease terms. It can be found in Baltimore, Seattle, Denver, Miami, a number of cities, and through which helps inform and understand the state of rental in these respective cities, that I think actually in Canada we don't have. That is actually, it's surprising, because as we see agencies, like major agencies, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the equivalent of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the US, I like to try to speak some American once in a while, that you really actually have this, I think, discussion now about what does Canada become in terms of a rental society. And yet I think within that conversation, it's not having the infrastructure to become a rental society. It's not really truly understanding the power asymmetries being in a rental society can have. And I think without dealing with those asymmetries, I think that it's now bringing forward, if not reinforcing, levels of inequality through which we only have yet at this point to really understand. Now, I think that bringing forward this discussion of fractionalized ownership, I think that it's really, I think, one that one has to be very careful on in terms of the discussion, because of the possibilities of recommoning real estate. But then at the same time, there's also that flip side of further hyper commodifying real estate. And I think that that is something that I think is a very, I think, key fundamental principle in terms of that type of conversation. And it's to really, not to say we shouldn't do it, but that it's really, I think, within the idea of fractionalized ownership and really how we move from the physical to the digital and take advantage of all the possibilities that brings forward, you have to also remember, that has began with condominiums. That if you read the kind of work of Doug Harris and the evolution of how the condo came about in law in British Columbia, it's a remarkable legal history, and it's worth, I think, exploring and understanding that, that it has been done in a much more analog method beginning in the 1960s and moving it forward. And how does it kind of plug in to this conversation of blockchain technology and its opportunities and the peril of recommoning it? And I think that really finally, it really is to really now, I think, begin and looking critically at this dialogue of talking about and looking and talk about, Canadian cities as perhaps one to pursue being a culture of renters, of renters now, I think, in one way being valorized, that I think that we still have substantial and major challenges in terms of moving from being cities of renters to being cities for renters. So I'll leave that conversation there, and I'll open it up for the panel.
Great, thank you so much, Andy, Ian, Maral, and Maxime. And yeah, we can echo, Andy, we've had a lot of trouble finding rental data to kind of reinforce the dashboard that DOMA has been doing. So we can definitely attest to that. And I think what's interesting about blockchain as a technology is that what it can do is it can also reinforce existing forms of decentralization that already exist in our societies. So as you're talking about this informality in the rental market, actually this is an optimistic thing for us to hear, kind of doing this research, and knowing that historically that marker of the city reaching a majority rentership, like as far back as the 1970s, is optimistic because, given the right communication tools and community building mechanisms, what we could do is we could reinforce what those networks already are, which provide space to people which are probably going to be below market because most people can't afford market. And you just wonder, I just walk on the streets and wonder, where do you live? How do you live? I see a mother with 3 children in a pram. Where are you living? How many children are in one bedroom? Are you sharing it with them? So obviously there's people already doing this decentralization and existing and living and finding ways to make this work. And those are through different forms of agreements and arrangements between partners. So with that in mind, I wonder if I could ask the question, yeah, just about those existing forms of decentralized forms of living, and how do you see us reinforcing them with these kind of platforms? And thank you, and maybe Ian, you have some ideas too, because you've spent a lot of time on both sides of the coin with some of the more darker sides of this real estate prop tech. And then thank you for bringing forward the kind of the topology of existing kind of groups who are doing the abolitionist work as well.
And I like to thank Ian for introducing me to that idea of abolitionist approach towards housing. I think that certainly, that's what the promise, I think, of this conversation does, is that we're now, I think, re-equalizing that power relationship. We are trying to break out that kind of power asymmetries, because to be honest, much of this type of information is available. It's just completely held in certain very, I think, tightly held circles, and it's not going to be released. I think that there's an article this morning talking about citizen researchers digging into the treasure trove of data that the government of British Columbia has now released. But then, of course, the problem is that it's $5 a record. So really, how much has that really kind of helped in terms of its kind of levels of transparency? But then I think that it is from the grassroots that I think there is this type of opportunity to kind of level the playing field. I think that the growth in terms of, I think, a kind of community-based prop tech in terms of monitoring evictions, in terms of understanding the role of displacement, that I think that is, I think, part of that type of innovation, and again, that part of that, and then kind of advancing that type of technology and ensuring a level of openness and I think availability. I think that is, I think, one that leads one for a lot of optimism in this space. But I'll pass it on to Ian for his comments.
Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate the question, and yeah, sorry to. I realize I did give quite a dark overview here of the prop tech landscape, and I think that it's important to acknowledge that it's not all doom and gloom, and that so much incredible work is being done both, you know, in terms of developing the technology and at the sort of grassroots analog level around this stuff. But just kind of in response to Jesse's point here, you know, what kinds of to spit it back, what kinds of existing forms of decentralized living, you know, how can we reinforce that, or how can we reinforce those through these platforms? You know, one thing that's stuck out to me when I was listening to Maxime's presentation about this is truly how the design and kind of philosophical approach to this technology really informs what it ends up being and doing. You know, so with DOMA, we have this object of a collective ownership model that's based on the blockchain, and in particular, I want to pull out this point of building equity. Right, that's something that I've seen in other prop tech firms, you know, proposed and as a model. So I'll briefly share my screen, just as I pulled this example up while I was thinking about this. A company called Rove. So this is it's a really interesting looking company. I think that they might have actually changed their business model a little bit since the last time I looked at them. You know, but they at some point had been giving renters a financial stake in their apartments, as they said, through something called a rentership model. Now, I think it's important to highlight, though, that conceptualizing rentership was always done under the rubric of kind of participating in financial markets, of an investor mentality that's sort of available to everyone and everybody. It was never necessarily about you know, ultimately the decommodification of housing or the definancialization of housing as an object of investment. And I think that that's where we can start to see the distinctions between some of these conventional prop tech firms and some of these abolitionist prop tech firms that do begin from the design stage, looking to kind of disrupt not innovation but disrupt the system, right? So hopefully that makes sense. And I also just wanted to make a quick note that I didn't see Jesse's message until after I had finished speaking, but I was talking about Zumper in Section 8, which I failed to kind of contextualize. But Section 8 is a rental assistance program in the U.S. that basically pays landlords the difference between what low-income households can provide and what the fair market rent is. So that's the context for Section 8, and you know, that hopefully clarifies maybe some questions around if people weren't familiar. Yeah, I guess I'll. I also had just a couple of other thoughts about Maxime's talk here that I think you brought up an interesting point about the inability to own in places like Vancouver. And it was pretty striking to see that visualization of the you know, home prices. I can't remember at what point that kind of came in your talk, but the visualization that where we can really see that it's so out of reach, right? And I think that Andy brings a really important perspective to this, because, you know, what I'm talking about is this sort of institutional or corporate landlordism, where, you know, my mind goes to, yeah, you know, a lot of these homes that are unaffordable and inaccessible to everyday people, even people who are relatively wealthy in housing markets like Vancouver, can't afford a lot of these homes. But you know, some of these hedge funds, private equity firms, real estate investment trusts are very cash rich and are able to kind of swoop in and buy these homes. Right now, Andy provides some great framing around how there's also this element of informality, right? That really characterizes markets in a way that sometimes gets lost in conversations about corporate landlordism. And you know, it's something that is it's important not to inflate it to be bigger than it really is. You know, and in the U.S. at least, corporate landlords, I think, only clock in for a single-digit percentage of all the rental housing. You know, it's not huge by any means. It's growing, and it's something to be aware of and address and think about in terms of its relationships to these markets and these technologies. But I think, again, it's a great point to highlight the informality that still characterizes so much of these markets.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah, I think the renters registry would be an interesting thing to see how that would take off, like in places like Vancouver, where we could kind of start to connect the dots around that informality. And would people be willing to kind of like self-report kind of what they're doing and their experiences are as renters, and kind of see how that could go.
Actually, there's a way of making it completely having not a choice, because there's something called an RTA1 agreement between a tenant and landlord. Any landlord and tenant have to fill that form. So why can't you send a copy into the provincial government for records?
Right.
So
right.
sorry, I always like to find, opportunities where you cannot escape a level of transparency and try to establish that toll booth, if you will. But that's the interesting opportunity in this type of discussion. I think that it's just really, really bringing into a level, like, because there's some benefits to that informality, but then there's also, I think, a certain level of cost in terms of not being counted. This entire informal rental marketplace is completely undercounted in the CMHC rental surveys. Like they're at best lucky to get the condominium rentals, but they don't have really an understanding of what happens to these other types of rentals, whether they be single family homes, basements, or laneway homes. That is actually probably one of the kind of key policy challenges, because we know that over the majority of rental in places like the city of Vancouver are in these informal relationships as opposed to the formal ones.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Yeah, putting the pressure on from both sides, getting the government to ask for them, having the people offer it up will show the landlords that you can't hide this information anymore. Totally. Maybe we could just switch over. We got a question coming in from the audience. So this is maybe one for Maral and Maxime to respond to, but it's coming from Ross Gentleman, who's our treasurer at 221A and was an advisor on this overall project. But he says tokenization is another form of financialization. And in the DOMA model, these instruments may be securities and subject to related regulation. Does DOMA financialization that gets residents to modestly participate as investors simply further financialization? Will securities regulation be a barrier? And can tokens be sold amassed to subvert democratic control within these kinds of platforms? So yeah, very good questions, Ross. And I think in the blockchain space, just as a caveat, we can say that this is an ever fluid conversation about what is a security and what is not. And often things that are tokenized are deemed securities and then become not securities, or they are deemed not securities and then all of a sudden they become securities. So like I said, this is the acculturation moment for the technology. But Maral, maybe you could respond with some of your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll pass it to Maxime in a moment here, but in terms of kind of, it is another form of financialization, and I think that's a very astute comment. I can't speak specifically to DOMA, but to your point, Jesse, I think that notion of kind of, if it's a Tuesday and the moon is waning, then maybe it's a security, and then it changes the next day, is one of the biggest, it's a very large problem space with any kind of tokenization. I mean, it seems very risky, obviously for the kind of the legal implications of the regulatory ones. And I would imagine, DOMA, and again, I won't speak for the project, but one of the challenges that we see with any really blockchain use case that attempts to kind of use networks that cross jurisdictions is that the regulatory obfuscation and like lack of existing regulations about how these operate, how these technologies kind of, and these tokens operate and circulate across borders, and where they become codified, for instance, if there is a law that kind of indicates that in this particular jurisdiction, this is how it works, is quite scary, frankly. And you can see this even like at the most basic level of, let's say you have Bitcoin you want to sell in Canada today. The legal ramifications of having mined your own Bitcoin or purchased it from, let's say local Bitcoins or a third-party custodial exchange that's essentially an unregulated bank, over time has changed so significantly and has like it really is. There's a temporality there to think about, and that's just one jurisdiction. That, for instance, if you're to mine your own Bitcoin today and you have evidence of that, or that you mined Bitcoin, let's say 10 years ago, and you try to kind of liquidate that using fiat, that's a very different tax implication than, say, having purchased it from some shady, dark web market 10 years ago, and trying to kind of essentially offload that right now to be able to kind of leverage that investment. So I think it's a real big problem. It's really challenging to figure out. I think that informality of the market is something that continues to persist. And I think the way that, a lot of different initiatives and tokens, regardless of kind of the use case that underpins their existence, just the way that it operates is that you just kind of, you roll with the risk, right? And because that risk is always going to kind of hit the end user. So it's really kind of an individualized experience. So I think that's probably kind of one of the bigger issues with regards to kind of that tokenization. And yeah, it's a real challenge. That said, for a lot of people who have big risk appetites, it's pretty enticing, right? Because, for instance, if you mined your own Bitcoin 10 years ago, and you can find a way to kind of translate into kind of liquid forms of capital, if you will, let's say fiat, even if you pay capital gains taxes on it, for instance, or let's say you didn't mine it and you purchased it, you're still sitting on quite a bit of money, right? Your return on investment is so high. And so I think that's where it kind of becomes really slippery, I guess. Maxim, I don't know if you probably something much more cogent to say, so I'll pass it.
No, I mean, I agree with what you just said, and I think it's a very good question. And I also wanted to thank you, Maral, because your insights sometimes, they bring a lot of interesting things to how we think about DOMA. So it's nice to see that someone who's trying to figure out what we're trying to do. But for sure, one of the main reasons for us not pursuing like funding and going for massive like trial of how this would work in real life is because like the incentive is there then to try to compete, and as soon as you're in that chase, you're kind of ultimately not doing what we want to do, right? So I mean, that's a very simple answer to what some of the things you were saying in the beginning. But then the second, of course, even more complicated question is then, even in an ideal world where we would be able to design the kind of fractional ownership scheme in a way that would make sense, and like we would have some sort of friction assigned to these assets so they're not extremely like liquid and day traded and stuff like that. It's still a question of like who's in and who's out. How does this work on the city scale? Does it actually change things structurally? So that's why we remain on this kind of layer with the help of 221A currently. But this is one of the biggest questions that I'm interested to figure out, because I mean, I think the only way to respond to that question is that, sure, like fractionalization in its kind of dispositional nature is definitely going to, even on the short term, it's definitely going to lead to further financialization, right? But then you get to see how like housing becomes this major asset class. Like most of economies have like around 50% of their GDP being like assets, and this like politically becomes impossible for governments to think about like definancialization of housing, right? You have rents that are relatively attached to incomes, but still, like depending on the situation, depending on the context, in some places like Berlin, for instance, like the ratio that people pay for rent is growing. And for Kiev, I'm not even saying, because most of the people we showed are data mistakes, because their figure is like 70-80% of average income that is rent. It's just unthinkable. So yeah, I mean, I'm just saying this to say that, I mean, if we know that rents are going to be this kind of struggle, and I very much like this idea of like city for renters as opposite of city of renters, and this is for sure an important battle to fight. But then the other question is like, what do we do with the housing as asset class, which has been accruing its value? And yeah, for us, that we just are questioning whether fractionalizing it and kind of thinking about like kind of making it something that belongs to commons is a way, and how is it possible to achieve? That's basically the kind of the long-term goals of the project.
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Of course, one of the, I think, biggest challenges in this conversation is the kind of role of financialization, the financialization of residential real estate. And I think that it's important to actually acknowledge that the entire mortgage system that was created, especially after the Second World War, was in an attempt to ensure a level of accessibility into home ownership and security and tenure. And I think that this is actually what makes it so tough. I mean, if you were in Vancouver circa 1920s, not Asian, you could buy a place in Vancouver, but you'd have to buy a place and buy property in Vancouver. Again, not being Asian, a woman, Indigenous, etc. But and actually the fact that you'd have to provide 1/3 of the payment up front, 1/3 of the payment 6 months later, and complete the transaction in a full year. So you'd have to pay off your entire property within 1 year. And I think that there were just iterations of that throughout up until the Second World War. I think through which, after the Second World War, with the returning veterans of coming back to Canada, realizing, hey, I just fought and a lot of my friends died for my country. I need a place to live with my family and want to continue on my life. That, mind you, it's interesting, side note, the amount of protest movements that occurred, which included the occupation of the Hotel Vancouver, that you see the creation of what would be the contemporary mortgage system in Canada. Now, from that point moving forward, you see the kind of pathways through which has created the actual hyper commodified residential real estate market that we see today. But then just to kind of beginning to understand that the financialization of residential real estate actually started, I think, in part as an attempt to ensure a level of affordability and security and tenure. So as a kind of lesson, if you will, almost a Darth Vader-esque arc of this type of technology, where it begins with the best of intentions, and yet here we are.
Great, thanks. Just a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A window, and we can bring you in them with a live voice, or we're happy to read out your question if you prefer to type it for the panelists to answer to. Just wondering if the panelists have questions for each other. Anything coming to mind in your notes?
I mean, I have one comment, I guess, that a couple of times when other people were speaking, I thought of the fact that I missed it in my part of presentation. And it's around this idea that also, next to what I just described as the kind of difficulty for the project, I guess one thing that is really worth fighting for is still this kind of idea of this ideological kind of limitation of, like how used we are to this idea of like a one family, one house situation, like especially in some of the Western kind of countries. I mean, that kind of situation is pretty difficult to change, and this is where indeed maybe this kind of extreme financialization, and I mean, for me, it's actually inspiring to see that people in Vancouver stop hoping for home, right? Like, because that means that Vancouver is reaching this moment when like it becomes obvious that something else needs to happen. So what to say is that there's this cultural shift that seems to be really necessary to do. And that's where we all kind of invite you to the ranks of propaganda for alternatives. And that's why it's good to have these events, simply because, yes, it seems like there is the need to at least be able to talk and imagine different scenarios.
Yeah, maybe that connects to what Ian brought in Lauren Berlant earlier, but it could connect to her idea of like the cruel optimism and kind of facing the reality of kind of what we have to do next in terms of providing for ourselves. But I think just to say also that on this front, these are all kind of like ideas and incredibly exciting kind of like propositions for where we could go, but there's still a lot of work that needs to happen. Like this is on the design side that we're talking in terms of the design and the tech stack of what could happen. But of course, there's a lot that needs to happen in the legal stack, in the physical development stack of homes within the city for this all to kind of converge into something that might be healthier and more cooperative. So yeah, with that in mind, I mean, I think what I'm looking forward to in terms of this future is these, I guess it goes back to our launch event that we had earlier in May, where Svetlana Matvienko from Simon Fraser's Digital Democracies Institute joined us, but she was bringing forward these ideas of Benjamin Bratton's kind of bordering and debordering of the state in terms of technology. And so where like the legal stack is shifting to accommodate this form of work within the property world, you know, it's to a benefit and it could be a disadvantage. Again, you have to use like really critical lenses to kind of see what's going on, but certain places can deregulate themselves to invite this technology to come in and go gangbusters. For instance, this might be like in Dubai, they've put their entire property registry on the blockchain. For good or for bad, I don't know. The country of Georgia has done this as well. Of course, they have a much shorter history of property ownership, so it might be an easy thing to do to try out and figure out what's next. Certain American states are doing this as well. So yeah, these are kind of testing grounds, and we've seen blockchain use kind of deregulated spaces also in other contexts of its development, such as refugee camps, to test things out where people don't have as many rights to stand up for. So I think, you know, when we see this starting to happen in places like Vancouver, we need to start asking, like, how are these deregulations happening? Who's pushing for them? And which communities are you really consulting with before you kind of make these decisions as well?
But I think that, Maxine, you really have hit, I think, a really interesting point, is that I think that there is now a tension in Vancouver, because now I think the idea of community versus property, I think that has now, really entered the type of lexicon in Vancouver that I think offers that opening in terms of innovation and change. I just finished a study whereby we found out that, you know, 1 in 5 property owners in Vancouver own a second property. So that idea of a question of justice, a question of fairness, and its very basic Rawlsian kind of levels, that seems to be a bit of a challenge and a bit of a problem. And I think that this is, I think, really that moment, I think, through which it offers that opportunity at that opening. And I think the interesting thing is, okay, well, how do we fill in that opening? I think, you know, how we fill this in with prop tech as an area, you know, this kind of, at least with a value of an abolitionist view towards property, I think is exciting. I think the issue of kind of how it brings together, I think, this idea of this new idea of wealth. I think how do we actually kind of rethink our ideas of wealth, I think, is that opportunity here.
I think also, though, related to that, you know, there's this, Andy, there's a really good point about kind of that tension between community and essentially kind of property ownership. But I think especially like in places like Vancouver, and I'd say Victoria is probably very similar in some ways, those are kind of increasingly in tension, but also working together. Right? We're just essentially kind of becoming these walking contradictions where, you know, the study you just kind of mentioned of 1 in 5 property owners in Vancouver have a second house or a second piece of property that they own. I would wager it's probably not too different over here across the strait. And, you know, I think especially as those tensions of, you know, trying to operate in cities as renters and recognizing that perhaps it's not, you know, at least in Victoria, it's not a city for renters in any way. That tension really kind of starts, I think, seeping into the cultural consciousness and moment, where you see people kind of really, you know, shifting their politics for practical reasons, where all of a sudden people who, you know, perhaps to go back to this conversation of kind of the idealization of home, right? And I'm thinking of Sophia Melson's work on Generation Share, this idea that we all have this trajectory of housing that we have to follow and eventually get to the single detached home. you know, I think a lot of folks feel that, especially as renters, but as those pressures of housing begin to intensify and amplify, you know, their lives change, especially, you know, in geographical context where there is no other option. You see those contradictions emerging really, really starkly, where all of a sudden it would be interesting to see what those 1 in 5 homeowners look like in terms of demographics. I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, I'd love to see it. But, you know, that old adage that we become what we hate, I think is something to keep in mind here, right? Because we're just kind of walking contradictions, and those contradictions are definitely kind of apparent, I think, as we kind of dig into that informal component, and also the kind of counter-idealization of home and housing as something that must be kind of defined in kind of more formal or traditional capitalist terms. So that would be a good study to look at.
Well, it's funny because I went into an essay with Penny Gerson over at UBC, and it actually was, you know, can we just stop this paradigm of renters versus owners and actually focus on what's really important, which is security of tenure, and actually kind of pursue the idea of security of tenure over one's lifespan and meeting the kind of suitability needs over one's lifespan that I think would really help us. And I think that right now, one of the kind of biggest housing kind of challenges in terms of how the system is stuck, the housing system is stuck, is actually the fact that we're now blessed or cursed with an extra 20 years of life. Women, an extra 25 years of life. Men, not so much. Got some bad news. But that I think that within that type of conversation is that we actually haven't really formatted our system in terms of that type of change. So for like not only in addition to this role of technology, but that for the various miracles and the privileges of, and you know, mind you, it's not completely even across various demographic groups to begin with that notation, but then the idea that we don't actually know, because there's so many of us now living past, you know, age 70. What happens? What's our system in terms of having that population not necessarily be living in exactly the same place as you did when you were 35? That is this incredibly ambiguous kind of environment, but yet at the same time, we all need that security and tenure. And I think that that's really, I think, a big kind of and gray area that I think that, mind you, at this mixed into all this is, I think, some really interesting work in terms of the idea of tenure neutrality and how that, I think, is a avenue through which I don't think we've necessarily seen in North America. It's actually one that's being pushed over in the Scandinavian countries in terms of tenure neutrality, but yet we ought to revisit this idea of tenure neutrality and a focus on security of tenure and a level of tenure neutrality.
Okay. One more question coming in from Ross Gentleman again. Many of the ideas and platforms under discussion may be technology dependent, but may not necessarily require or benefit substantially from blockchain technology. Distributed ledger technology is another term for it. So what is the role for blockchain specifically within these platforms?
I mean, I can start it if that
Go ahead.
Folks gather their thoughts. I think, you know, it's a really good point. And one of the things that I tell people every day in my day-to-day job is you don't need a blockchain probably for what you're proposing. And this spans across, it's not just in terms of kind of the context that we're talking about today, but I think just general use cases, you know, the blockchain as a universalizing technology or DLTs, distributed ledger technologies, that umbrella of terms, however you kind of define it, in many ways, and for most use cases, I would argue, is a solution looking for a problem that is often kind of just the latest. And I think this is a very normal reality for any kind of big systemic problem or even kind of policy problem where you don't have an answer. And so you look for a quick solution. And so this thing looks like it does all the things, so let's use it. I do think there might be a space though for thinking critically about what, if you want to call it specifically, right? And I think that's kind of the big distinction for me. So, you know, very bizarrely, perhaps, I think Bitcoin's great as a concept, right? I mean, I think it's a very elegant idea, poorly implemented, and scales horribly, and has some real practical limitations to it. But the notion of kind of what it's trying to solve and why, it goes back to that design question. It does make sense to some extent. And so I'd argue that, there might be some space, for instance, especially thinking about the context of 221A and the work you do, to think very critically about tokenization and what it affords you, and whether or not to I think Maxim's point earlier, the ideological kind of positionings that we're trying to operate from and what we're trying to accomplish, that might be one entry point into a solution. But this notion that like it has to be on a blockchain, or even to your point, Jesse, at the top of the panel, that, just blockchain in the, what was it, business in the front, blockchain in the back. I think it's a big distractor, and it's, if people lead with that, it's usually a bit of a red flag, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can say quite honestly that for us it was, it was sort of a getaway to think about these things. Like, it was like this kind of moment that enables you to think about what is actually possible. And, I know a lot of people who come from that kind of space back in like 2016, think about those things. And of course, like everything that we've shown so far and everything that we prototyped, you don't need blockchain to build. But at the same time, there are certain concepts, like for instance, again, NFTs that, we were kind of considering as a kind of way to have like property specific, assets and stuff like that. That you just can see how they become normalized, how they kind of enter general kind of, like people are also getting used to them, therefore they are a bit less exclusive. And it's certainly interesting to see how that space evolves. But for sure, like if someone tells you that this is absolutely impossible without blockchain and that it's like the kind of cure of all of our problem, that's definitely sounds suspicious.
Yeah. Great. Were there any more questions coming from the panelists for each other? Well, maybe we could leave it there for today and the conversation can continue. So email us if you have any questions. We're happy to put you in touch with some of the panelists, maybe if you're interested in their work. I just wanted to share my screen before we sign off here. One moment. Great. So we're almost at the end of our launch series for the Blockchains and Cultural Padlocks series. So we have one final event, which isn't going to be a live one, but something we've already recorded and we're looking forward to sharing with you next week on Friday. The edit should be finished, but it's a roundtable where we talk with a bunch of groups developing social tokens and distributed autonomous organizations, where that question of what blockchain could be used for is very important. So if you want to sign up to our mailing list, that's something you could do to receive that, or just stay tuned and visit our website at 221a.ca, and you could find that video coming out next week. So thank you, Maral, thank you, Andy, thank you, Ian, thank you, Maxime, for all of your time and all of the work that you've put together, and I look forward to seeing how this conversation might inform your future work. We might be able to collaborate together. So thank you so much, and have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, folks. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Take care.
Ciao. Bye-bye.